Muy buenas, continuamos aquí en el informativo de Negocios Televisión. Vamos a hacer un pequeño paréntesis en la información para ahora mismo dedicar unos minutos sobre todo a la inversión sostenible, a la inversión ESG. Ha habido una burbuja en esta inversión y por tanto estamos viendo ahora el estallido. Se lo vamos a preguntar a Daniel Roarty, que está ahora mismo con nosotros aquí en el plató de Negocios Televisión y que es gestor de Alliance Bernstein Global Thematics Portfolio. Daniel, thank you so much for being here in Negocios Televisión. It's a pleasure.
That's my pleasure. Very happy to be here.
We're going to speak about sustainable investing, and the performance of sustainable funds this year has been very poor and generally underperforming their equivalent in the sustainable space. So is there any reason for that? Has there been a bubble in the ESG investments that has burst now?
Right. Well, I think you're right. Sustainable investments broadly have underperformed their benchmarks this year. I think if we look across all sustainable funds, probably 80% of them have outperformed over the last 3 years, but 80% of them have probably underperformed this year in 2022. So there has been a big change this year. But I think rather than seeing the underperformance of ESG or sustainability, what we're really seeing is the underperformance of high quality growth. So during 2022, we had a very strong rotation towards low quality value stocks, especially in the first quarter, probably one of the strongest moves towards low quality value since the late 1970s. So against that kind of backdrop, all high quality growth funds had a tough time. And we know that most sustainable funds tend to have a high quality growth style. So I think what we're really seeing this year, it's not that ESG is a bubble that's bursting. It's not that the opportunities connected with sustainability are any less than they were or that they're diminishing. You know, really, I think it has more to do with the style shift that we saw in the market this year.
Daniel, sustainable investing means a different thing according to different asset managers. So I wanted to ask you exactly what is sustainable investing for you and how do you translate that into your investment process and your investment strategy?
Yeah, so I think that's right. So there are different acronyms and there are different definitions for things that can sometimes be confusing. I think there's a positive to that. You know, it's a sign that sustainable investing or ESG investing isn't just one thing. It's not just one style. There are a range of different sustainability and ESG styles, which means that they can serve different purposes in clients' portfolios. So that's the positive. Now, in our case, we define sustainable investing as earning strong returns by owning companies that are helping make a better world. That's probably the easiest way that we can describe it. A key concept behind our vision of sustainable investing is that we know we have massive social challenges, everything from decarbonization to healthcare and education and clean water provision and food security. And governments can't solve those challenges on their own. They need the private sector. They need the innovation potential that the private sector can offer. They need the financial capital that the private sector can bring. And so sustainable investing to us it's the challenge of finding that intersection between that social need and also where the private sector can provide solutions.
However, energy, for example, has been one of the top performing sectors this year, year to date, but it seems to be inconsistent with an ESG approach. So what is your view in this topic?
So I think it depends, again, on how you want to define ESG investing or sustainable investing, what type of strategy you are. If it's a strategy where you want to own companies that are currently doing positive things for the environment, let's say probably most energy stocks are not going to qualify. If you are the type of fund that's looking to own companies that are enabling a more responsible transition, maybe away from the current environment towards a cleaner future, then possibly energy stocks could be appropriate. Now, in our case, we don't actually own fossil fuel energy stocks in our portfolio. Again, we would tend to align our portfolio with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We use that more as a guide and a framework, and in that context, more traditional fossil fuel companies don't tend to align very, very well with what we're looking for. As you point out, that's been a negative for performance this year, so that certainly cost us as energy stocks have done well. And so it's a risk that I suppose we take not owning those. We're very comfortable with that risk. One of the main reasons is that if we expand our horizon, so beyond what's happened here in 2022, and as we look forward, we think that the tailwinds behind the non-fossil fuel energy stocks are actually quite strong, and if anything, they're accelerating, and so we feel that's actually going to be a good place to be.
Actually, Daniel, I wanted to talk to you about perspectives for the coming years. What do you anticipate as headwinds? You just spoke about tailwinds, but as headwinds and tailwinds also for the sustainable thematic investment in the coming years?
Well, I think probably the biggest headwind has to do that really impacts all stocks is the slowing macroeconomy and decelerating earnings growth and negative revisions to earnings. So we know that central banks have been tightening, and we know that that is going to have an effect on the real economy in the future. We haven't really started to see that yet. We haven't started to see that show up in negative estimate revisions, but we feel fairly confident that that probably is something that we will see in front of us. Now, in that context, typically higher quality companies tend to hold up very well. So unlike earlier this year, the stocks that you would expect to perform the best in a slowing macroeconomy are ones that do have clean balance sheets. They are ones that have high profitability and more stable business models. So really higher quality companies, and that's very consistent with a more sustainable approach. So we do think that there's a headwind of a slowing macroeconomy, but that most sustainable portfolios that focus on high quality companies should actually be very well positioned. From a thematic standpoint, or from just thinking about through a sustainable lens, we actually think there are more tailwinds than headwinds. So the trends towards decarbonization continue. We still obviously are in the midst of a health crisis. We have food crisis, a water crisis. So a lot of the tailwinds that typically propel growth in those sustainability areas are still with us, and so we think we'll still see, on balance, we think more tailwinds than headwinds.
Just to finalize, Daniel, recently we had the climate summit, the COP27, and it's taken place in Egypt, and I wanted to ask you if there's any takeaway that it's worth mentioning in your opinion.
Yeah, I think so. I think with any of the COPs, we tend to see probably more negative headlines about them than positive right after they're finished. And I think there's this expectation that somehow we'll have a conference and that we'll fix climate, and that coming out of that, those events, that climate's not a problem anymore. When that doesn't happen, sometimes people are disappointed. And of course we know it's not really the way it works. Solving climate is a global issue. Solving it's going to require very complex multilateral cooperation. Clearly takes some time. So I think there were both some negatives, but also some positives coming out of COP27. On the negative side, the big negative was that we didn't get firmer commitments on decarbonizing. So if we're going to hit the 1.5 degree target that we typically hear talked about, we're going to need to reduce carbon emissions by something like 5 to 8% annually through 2030. And the current commitments that countries have made are only going to get us to about 1%. So there was a hope that at COP we would see firmer, more aggressive commitments, and we didn't really see that. So that was a disappointment and something that we're going to need to see more progress on. But then we did have positives. We did have things like the establishment of the loss and damage fund, where we know that smaller countries haven't had a lot to do with the climate crisis, but they're suffering the most from it. And so there was at least an agreement that we're going to have some of the more developed countries step in to help some of those less developed countries deal with the effects of climate change. So I think it was a mix of both positives and negatives.
Daniel Roarty, Asset Management at Alliance Bernstein Global Thematics Portfolio. Thank you so much for being here in Negocios Televisión. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bueno, pues nos decía Daniel Roarty, entre otras cosas, que por ejemplo sí que es cierto que este año las acciones, las empresas del sector, bueno, pues más sostenible a la hora de invertir, es cierto que lo han hecho peor, pero que al final también tiene mucho que ver sobre todo con el sector growth, con el sector de las compañías en crecimiento, que al final es el que este año también se ha visto más perjudicado. Nos quedamos con esto, con esta información sobre lo que está sucediendo en torno a la inversión sostenible. Hacemos una pequeña pausa y volvemos enseguida con más información de esta jornada de jueves, y además también con la entrevista a Juan Ramón Rayo sobre el último libro que ha publicado, Anti-March. Enseguida volvemos.